There are several communication problems that plague high school students all around our nation. One of which being a severe lack of confidence when it comes to real world public speaking skills. Another of which being that they report having high levels of communication apprehension and high levels of public speaking anxiety. Well, how do we go about solving problems like this? Well, I have found that based upon the research, that really what students need is exposure to real world public speaking scenarios, incorporating relevant activities that really target that audience in a way to make them feel more comfortable, develop confidence, and ultimately feel better about tasks associated with communication, like interviewing. And so that's really what my capstone hopes to address is that there is a huge gap between students who have learned how to interview and students who have not. And with that being said, the needs assessment associated with this capstone really does a wonderful job at assessing where students are on that spectrum. So I'd like to talk to aspects of this needs assessment and really identify how aspects of each question really help identify problem areas, learning gaps, um, even areas of concern associated with the training to make it so that the training continues to be successful, is research based, and really focuses on the needs of the participants. So, to begin, I want to state that the needs assessment does ask for a very honest and open opinion following all of the questions. When students are given permission to be honest with their answers and they know that that information is going to be used to help the instructor give a better training, a more specific training, an individualized training, training that is really relevant to them, it makes a big difference in how they go about answering the questions. Even spending a little bit more time reading the questions to think, well, is this going to have an impact on what I'm learning in this classroom? And I'm going to tell you, it really does have an impact on the training itself. A needs assessment is incredibly crucial in making sure that an instructor can really analyze a student's learning goals, learning styles, and performance gaps associated with even developing common interview answers or even how they feel related to communicating in real world public speaking scenarios. Now, this particular needs assessment was given to students via something called Google Classroom. Now, it was very easy to administer because the Google platforms, Google Forms actually, is easy to access. It can be used with a URL code. Students do not have to be trained on how to answer the survey. And then that information is very quickly uploaded into pie graphs and percentages. So it makes it easy for an instructor to take an overview of that information and apply it to a training. Well, I found it incredibly valuable for my own students. Now, the reason why that data is so important is because when it's compiled from that needs assessment, it will ensure that the training is incredibly relevant and avoids wasting time on topics that, well, students have already received previous training for, maybe in other lessons or in a club or organization like Future Business Leaders of America. So, I want to show you an example. The very first question of the needs assessment, which is for students to check all of the following that apply to their experiences, learning, performing, and preparing for interviews. So, something like a firm handshake. Do they know how to do that? Do they know how to sit professionally in a seat during an interview? Do they know what to wear before they show up to an interview? Now, all of those things are not necessarily communication problems, they may just be gaps in learning. But there are other things on this particular checklist that are very specific to a communication classroom, which is taking main topics, formulating very, very specific answers, even incorporating storytelling that most students really don't have a lot of training on. Here's what I found. English language arts classrooms do a phenomenal job at giving students opportunities to practice oral communication. But primarily students are really given opportunities to practice writing speeches on note cards or pieces of paper, uh, putting together some sort of PowerPoint to project behind them. They may even work collaboratively in a group environment and then share aspects of a presentation. But working collaboratively is not going to help them in an interview. Having a PowerPoint is not something common in an entry level job, which is something that students are going to be getting or may be interviewing for. And I'm definitely not saying that those skills are not important, but then it leaves a gap between students who know how to interview and students who don't know how to interview. And as a result, that particular gap creates a communication problem, especially related to communication apprehension, public speaking anxiety, and a lower level of confidence associated with interviewing. So that's what the following questions are meant to address. Have students been given specific training on things like preparing responses for common interview prompts, like tell me a little bit about yourself? Have they planned answers for popular interview questions? Have they practiced techniques that will make them more effective when it comes to interviewing? Have they even thought about some sort of closing statement that will make them sound professional and ready to take on the business world? Have they even thought about the things that they've done in their life that would make them incredibly suited for any position that they're interviewing for? In other words, have they thought about the topics that they're going to use to build answers? And on the other side, have they thought about topics that maybe they should avoid when they're answering particular interview questions? Now, here is what I found with students in my classroom that took the survey in spring of 2020. That a lot of them, 86% of them, had already had training on some of those things like firm handshakes. 81% of them had already been taught to about or trained on what kind of attire to wear before an interview. That didn't particularly surprise me, but it did surprise me that 44% of the students reported that they had actually thought about topics they could use to build answers for their interview. That means that over half of the students in the training had not even been been given experiences, had thought about, been trained on how to build interview answers that were specific to them that could really help them prove that they are the best person for the job. With that being said, even though some students had prepared responses for common interview questions, like tell me a little bit about yourself, after looking at this needs assessment, I started to ask students where and how they did that. And it was a common answer that they had written down answers. Again, this is another important concept associated with communication problems. It's been found that students benefit from practice, from thinking about answers, incorporating impromptu speaking in order to get them prepared for what an interview will actually be like. Now, here's some other things that really stood out to me. And you can see this directly on the screen that, they hadn't really practiced techniques to make them successful at interviewing. They had never tried to sit down in a chair to get themselves comfortable or figure out ways to lower their heart rate and blood pressure, which are incredibly common when it comes to public speaking anxiety. They hadn't even thought about ways or practice ways to develop a mindset that would help them feel better before they interview, which is incredibly important when it comes to students who report having a high communication apprehension level. So all of this data was incredibly important when I was trying to individualize the instruction, put together groups so that they could practice impromptu speaking skills, or even make it so that the students felt like the training was relevant. So I asked students to tell me how that they had practiced interviewing in the past, whether that be mock interviewing family members, mock interviewing all by themselves, maybe in a mirror, if they had never practiced interviewing before, if they have videotaped themselves, mock interviewed with peers, or had just written out answers for possible interview responses. This is where I really felt like it was important to analyze the findings because 26% of the students said that they had not practiced interviewing and that maybe they had 42% of them had said that they had mock interviewed with peers before. 36% of them that said that they had mock interviewed with family members. Um, but this isn't going to be enough to make them feel confident, to boost their self-esteem, to make it so that they can think off the top of their head when it comes to answering really common interview prompts. There was a big gap here, a gap between what I thought they had been experiencing and what they had actually been experiencing. Overall, this means that students really do need specific training when it comes to interviewing. And I really do feel that even this one particular question helps me provide, gives me the data that I need to show gaps in student skills, experiences, and knowledge when it comes to interviewing. Now, the last question that I want to talk about related to the findings that I feel are incredibly important to this needs assessment is the last question on the survey. And the reason why it's the last question on the survey is because it was strategically placed there to allow students the time to really think about how much they know about interviewing, their experiences related to interviewing, whether or not they've mock interviewed, who they've mock interviewed with. And this gave me, I would say, probably the most honest opinion from students who took the survey in spring of 2020. And that's because it gave me students' opinions on how prepared they felt to interview with the panel of interviewers on a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being completely unprepared and 5 being very prepared. The survey results help me really show relevancy for the content, remind students that we're getting there, that we can work through this, that we're working through this together as a team. And that relevance is so incredibly important to high school students and adolescents because they really need that to feel that buy-in. With that being said, I think that it's important to recognize that adolescents really do benefit from training that's very specific to their age group. Beyond examining the impact that stress or feedback or social sensitivity has on an adolescent in that age group, it's important to examine their physical, social, societal, and academic pressures that they're all facing. Let's be honest, students are trying to find a job at this point. Students are interviewing for scholarships. Students know that they're going to need to have these skills. And so if they feel that they're scoring themselves as a 3 or 2, or even worse off, a 1, man, they really do feel that an immense amount of buy-in. So 76 students were surveyed using this needs assessment. And out of all of those students, 4 of them said that they felt very prepared to interview. Now, I actually have the benefit of getting to know my students one-on-one. And I can tell you that the 4 students who rated themselves as a 5 had justifiable reasons to rate themselves that way. One of which being that they had been in extracurricular activities that really promote the use of oral communication skills. Future Farmers of America, FFA, Future Business Leaders of America, FBLA, those were experiences that they had had, that they had already interviewed. Now, the 18 students that said that they felt prepared, but maybe not very prepared, I also talked to them. It is really amazing to think that students have already had experiences interviewing. But I did ask them, well, are you excited to interview with a panel? And it was obvious that those light bulbs were going off. Well, no, I just interviewed with one person was a very common follow-up statement that was made. And so it's incredibly important to remember that a needs assessment is a snapshot of how people feel before a training. But if that information is never used to back up thoughts or theories associated with the trainees, that information is definitely going to be skewed, because out of those 18 students, 7 of them said that they were just ready to interview with somebody one-on-one and that they probably should have given themselves a 2 or a 3. But I think it's important to look at where a majority of the students in the communication class really put themselves. That was at a 3. 34 students, 44% of them said that they definitely were unprepared or put themselves right in the middle of that spectrum. And that's fine. It actually makes it so that, again, like I said, the information that is addressed in that training is relevant for students. So, overall, my position regarding needs assessment and the development of a training program comes from my belief that people are genuinely motivated to learn when they believe the content is relevant. Now, I'm going to have to admit that after teaching a classroom setting for 17 years, that I may have given students a survey before a unit, but because I wanted to keep everybody on the same track, it was also not uncommon for me to take a look at that data, kind of push it off to the wayside and proceed how I wanted to make sure the training was going to proceed. And failing to incorporate that data really did mean that I wasn't meeting the specific needs of the students that were in that class, or the organization. I was off track. It is not to say that students didn't benefit, but I could have done a much better job ensuring that they did benefit from other activities or units that were in my classroom. So, as an educator, I really do feel that looking back at those experiences, I realized that the times that I failed to spend time analyzing the data to guide my instruction really led to a limited ability to address the needs of my learners, and it made it difficult to provide justification for relevancy of the course content. However, when I use this data for this specific instruction, I really feel like it's going to help me continue to address gaps in learning, differentiate instruction with ease, and ensure the activities meant to meet the expectation of the students and the administration.